Are you seriously going to wear that ragged piece of trash to your own wedding? Serafina's voice hissed through the speakerphone, blindingly loud and sharp, like a rusted saw blade scraping straight against my eardrums. Are you not woman enough to put on a normal dress? Before my lungs could even suck in a breath of air, my father's voice cut in, suffocating the room. That freak costume is a disgrace, Lauren. Take it off right now. Don't turn me into some hillbilly clown in front of my business partners. I stood dead still in the freezing dressing room of the Quantico-based chapel. Underneath this heavy wool uniform was a grid of scars I earned protecting thousands of lives, yet it couldn't protect me from the blades of my own blood. The exact second I reached up to unbutton the collar and surrendered to my fate, a heavy, muffled thud. A vibration that rattled the foundation stone echoed from the other side of the heavy oak door. But before I tell you exactly who is standing behind that door, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I understand if you've ever been disowned by your own family. The silent punishment that follows is something nobody in my bloodline ever saw coming. The vibration from the door shot straight up through the soles of my combat boots. I jerked my hand away from the brass button at my throat. On the cracked screen of my phone, the call timer was still ticking, mocking me. My father's voice bled through the speaker again. It was cold, dismissive, and reeked of old corporate money. I paid for this chapel. I wrote the check, Lauren. I forbid you from bringing that backwoods military trash in here to ruin my VIP guest list. You are embarrassing me. Acid churned in the pit of my stomach, burning its way up my throat. I didn't scream. I didn't waste a single syllable trying to explain honor to a man who only understood profit margins. I just picked up the phone. My grip tightened on the device until the joints in my fingers popped and my knuckles turned bone white. With a sharp, violent downward swing, I slammed it into the corner of the heavy rosewood vanity. Crack! The glass shattered instantly. Tiny, jagged shards bit deep into the palm of my hand. A drop of blood welled up, dark and thick. But the toxic feed from the other end of the line was finally dead. The room crashed into a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound left was the hollow, rhythmic ticking of a vintage pocket watch sitting on the counter. I ignored the sting in my hand and turned slowly, facing the full-length mirror. 4 silver stars gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights pinned into the shoulders of my midnight blue uniform. My hand moved on its own. I traced the rigid wool collar, my thumb pressing hard against the raised, jagged scar just below my collarbone. An Iraqi RPG left that mark in Fallujah. It wasn't a goddamn costume, it was a survival map. Woven from betrayal, knee-deep, mud sleep deprivation, and the stench of burnt diesel and death. And they wanted to strip it off. My own flesh and blood wanted me to shed the only thing that ever protected me. They wanted me to drape myself in some flimsy, translucent white silk, to play the part of a quiet, brainless little ornament for their corporate dinner table. Disgust clawed at the back of my throat, tasting like rusted iron. I squared my shoulders. I locked my jaw so hard my teeth ached. There wouldn't be a single tear today. I'd bled way too much in the sand to cry over these people. Out in the hallway, the sharp, rapid clack-clack of designer stilettos echoed against the marble floor. It was Serafini. She was pacing right outside my door like a vulture waiting for something to die. I could hear her fake, syrupy laugh bleeding through the heavy wood. She was already out there doing damage control, playing the role of the perfect, put-together older sister. Apologizing to the hedge fund managers and the Wall Street elites for her mentally unstable sibling. It was a textbook ambush. She was isolating me, using the family name to cut off my supply lines and corner me exactly like insurgents pinning down a lone, stranded outpost. I stared at the brass doorknob. It looked freezing to the touch. If I turned it right now, if I walked out into that nave wearing this uniform, I'd be walking straight into a firing squad of judgment. Hundreds of pairs of eyes ready to dissect me, to mock me at my own altar. The isolation wrapped around my ribs like a vice, squeezing the oxygen straight out of my lungs. I took 2 steps backward. My boots hit the marble floor with a heavy, deliberate thud. I squeezed my eyes shut. I tried to anchor my racing mind. I recited Theodore Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena in my head, trying to focus on the dirt, the sweat, and the glory of the fight. It didn't work. The darkness behind my eyelids offered zero peace. Instead, it dragged up a filthy, relentless reel of memories I thought I had buried beneath layers of military discipline. This rejection wasn't a sudden attack. It wasn't just about a wedding dress. It was a psychological siege, one they'd been laying down for decades. It started back when I was just a skinny, quiet kid, stupid enough to believe that a perfect report card would finally make my old man look at me with an ounce of respect. The pristine walls of the Quantico Chapel began to warp and melt away. The crisp scent of starch and brass polish vanished, replaced instantly by the suffocating smell of burnt gravy and expensive wine. I was falling backward, losing my footing in the present, pulled straight down into the memory of a rotting oak dining table. It was Thanksgiving. I was 16 years old. And it was an absolute bloodbath. The pristine white walls of the Quantico Chapel melted away. The crisp scent of starch and brass polish vanished from my lungs. Instead, the air grew thick with the suffocating smell of roasted turkey, burnt gravy, and expensive Cabernet. I was falling backward, losing my footing in the present, dragged straight down into the memory of a rotting oak dining table. It was Thanksgiving. I was 16 years old, and it was an absolute bloodbath. I walked into the crowded dining room carrying a single sheet of paper. My SAT score report, 1600. A perfect score. I placed it quietly on the edge of the heavy oak table, right next to my father's crystal wine glass. For a fraction of a second, his hand stopped. He looked down at the printed numbers. The rigid, judgmental lines around his mouth actually relaxed. He opened his mouth, drawing a breath, preparing to ask me about Ivy League college applications. He never got the words out. Serafina cut him off. She leaned across the table, her blonde hair falling perfectly over her shoulder. She smiled. It was a sweet, sugary smile laced heavily with pure arsenic. "Oh, Dad, Lauren is doing just great at school," she said, her voice projecting loud enough to carry over the chatter of the entire room. "She joined the wrestling team. Did you all know she can pin down boys twice her size? She is an absolute beast on the mat." It was a calculated surgical strike. With 2 short sentences, she took a monumental academic achievement and twisted it into a crude, ugly joke. She painted me as some hulking masculine freak in front of our wealthy corporate relatives. The dining table erupted into a chorus of polite, mocking laughter. A few of my uncles smirked, shaking their heads as their eyes darted judgmentally to my shoulders. My father's expression hardened instantly. The brief flash of pride in his eyes died, replaced by a heavy, familiar disgust. He pushed my score report away like it was a dirty napkin. He did not ask about college. Instead, he stood up, tapped his glass, and proposed a loud toast to Serafina's new public speaking award, a hollow, meaningless plastic trophy she bought with her manipulative charm. I sat there in the middle of a crowded room, completely invisible. The air hummed with the clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china and the loud, obnoxious laughter of the elite. But inside my chest, there was just a cold, echoing void. I put a piece of dry turkey into my mouth. It tasted like ash and cheap salt. It lodged in my throat, bitter and thick, refusing to go down. I gripped my silver fork. I squeezed the metal handle until my knuckles throbbed and the tendons in my wrist strained. I drove the metal tines straight down through the meat, violently piercing the thick, decorative paper plate underneath, digging into the wood of the table. They erased me. Right there in my own home, in front of a dozen people, I was publicly executed without a single bullet being fired. But the ultimate betrayal came 2 years later. I was 18. I secretly applied for an NROTC scholarship to join the United States Marine Corps. It was my only ticket out. I needed one final critical recommendation letter from my instructor to secure my spot. The deadline was closing in fast. I checked the mailbox every single afternoon. The letter never arrived. I knew better than to ask questions. I relied on the silent observation skills I developed just to survive in that toxic house. When the house was empty, I slipped into Serafina's bedroom. I dug past the designer shoes and the overpriced silk dresses. At the very bottom of her laundry basket, buried under dirty clothes, I found it. The thick, official military envelope. It was ripped aggressively in half. I picked it up. A harsh chemical stench hit my nose. The torn paper edges were smeared with dark red nail polish. The door clicked open behind me. Serafina walked in. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She walked over to her velvet chair, sat down, and crossed her legs. Her face was a mask of utter, chilling indifference. "Those grunts would eat you alive, Lauren," she said, casually inspecting her fingernails. "I hid it to protect you. You are way too bland and weak for the military. Someday you will get down on your knees and thank me for stopping you from making a fool of yourself." I stood frozen, holding the torn pieces of my escape plan. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not slap her flawless, hypocritical face. Arguing with a narcissist is like shooting bullets into a brick wall. You only end up catching the ricochet. I looked down at the ruined letter. The toxic smell of the acetone burned my nostrils. It was a silent declaration of war. I walked out of her room in dead silence. I went straight to my desk. My eyes locked onto a history book lying open on the wood. The words of Theodore Roosevelt stared back at me in the dim light. "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. If you have ever had your hard work twisted into a joke by the exact people who were supposed to protect you, or if you have ever had to fight alone just to prove you exist, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word survivor down below. I read every single one of your stories, and I know exactly how that cold isolation feels. You are not alone in this fight. I did not pack a suitcase. I grabbed a faded canvas duffel bag and shoved 2 sets of clothes and a pair of heavy boots inside. I did not leave a note. I walked out the front door of that rotting oak house and never looked back over my shoulder. The night air was freezing, biting at my exposed arms. I threw the heavy canvas bag into the passenger seat of my beat-up, rusty Ford truck. The door slammed shut with a harsh, metallic clang. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it hard. The old engine roared to life, a loud, violent mechanical growl that shattered the quiet, perfectly manicured suburban street. A thick cloud of exhaust swallowed the driveway. I slammed my heavy boot down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched, gripping the cold asphalt as I tore through the pitch-black night, heading straight for the military recruiting station across town. The days of begging for a seat at their table were over. My campaign to buy my honor with my own blood had officially begun. The roaring engine of my rusty Ford truck eventually faded into the brutal, suffocating heat of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The air inside the base was thick enough to chew. It smelled of stale sweat rifle oil and pure concentrated testosterone. I wore the gold bar of a second lieutenant on my collar and in this specific combat unit that made me a walking target. The enlisted men and junior officers called me the Ice Princess behind my back. I earned the title because I refused to play their games. I did not laugh at their crude locker room jokes. I did not smile when they tried to corner me in the mess hall. I kept my boots, shined my uniform, flawless, and my mouth shut. My existence in their ranks was a threat to their fragile egos. My primary enemy did not wear expensive suits like my father. He wore the same green camouflage I did. First Lieutenant Decker. Decker was a man who viewed the presence of a woman in a combat zone as a personal insult to his masculinity. Before the mandatory 3-day solo survival test in the Carolina backcountry, Decker was the officer in charge of issuing gear. I stood in front of his supply desk. He looked at me and smiled. It was a thin, rat-like smirk that made my skin crawl. He shoved a folded topographical map against my chest and dropped a standard-issue military compass into my open palm. "Good luck out there, Lieutenant," Decker said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "The swamp gets mighty dark for a girl all alone." I did not reply. I secured my gear and walked out. I did not know it yet, but the coordinate grid on that map was entirely fabricated. It was a fake. The compass he handed me was deliberately demagnetized. He wanted me to fail. He wanted me to wander aimlessly in the pitch-black swamp, panic, key the emergency radio, and cry for a rescue team. He wanted a recorded audio log of my failure to prove to the entire battalion that women were just fragile, useless liabilities. Midnight hit on day 1. I stood waist-deep in the stagnant, rotting swamp water. The smell of decaying vegetation and sulfur punched the back of my throat. The darkness was absolute. It swallowed the trees. It swallowed the sky. I pulled my radio from my tactical vest and pressed the transmission button to report my first checkpoint. Static hissed back at me. Dead air. The frequency was jammed. I looked down at the compass in my hand. The needle spun lazily in a useless circle. I realized exactly what Decker had done. A normal recruit would panic. They would scream into the dark. I did not waste a single calorie of energy on anger. I reached down to my right thigh. A jagged submerged tree branch had sliced right through my heavy utility trousers. Warm blood ran down my leg, mixing with the freezing swamp water. I grabbed the torn fabric bit down hard on the edge and ripped a long strip free. I tied it tight over the bleeding gash, securing a makeshift tourniquet. I tilted my head back. Through a small narrow break in the dense forest canopy, I found the North Star. I unpinned a small brass safety pin from the inside pocket of my utility blouse. I crouched down in the mud, found a smooth piece of slate rock, and struck the pin against the hard surface over and over, forcing a temporary magnetic charge into the metal. I plucked a dry leaf from a nearby branch, placed it on a shallow puddle of still water, and rested the pin on top. Slowly, the metal tip rotated. It settled, pointing due north. I memorized the bearing. I threw the fake map into the muddy water and started drawing a new map inside my head. 72 hours passed. I did not get one single minute of sleep. I dragged my heavy boots through mud that felt like wet concrete. The thick stitching on my right boot blew out on day 2. Filthy swamp water flooded in. The skin on my toes blistered, swelled, and finally tore open against the wet leather. Giant briar patches ripped across my Kevlar vest and shredded the exposed skin of my forearms. Dried blood flaked off my skin with every step I took. Every movement was pure, agonizing torture. But I had an endless supply of fuel. Every time my knees shook, every time my lungs burned for oxygen, I thought about that rotting oak dining table. I thought about the smell of nail polish remover on my torn scholarship letter. Decker and my family were the exact same breed of monster. They wanted me to crawl. They wanted me to beg for mercy and accept my place at the bottom. Not today. Not ever. I locked my jaw until I tasted copper in my mouth. I pulled my heavy steel machete from its sheath and hacked fiercely through a thick wall of vines. I kept my spine straight. I marched forward. Morning broke on day 4. Inside the warm, brightly lit command post, Decker sat comfortably at a metal folding table. He held a red pen in his hand, fully prepared to write my name on the official dropout roster. I did not knock. I raised my heavy, mud-caked boot and kicked the wooden door dead center. The door flew open, slamming violently against the dry wall with a thunderous crack. I stood in the doorway. Black swamp mud coated me from the collar of my neck down to my ruined boots. My face was a grid of bleeding scratches. But I stood rigid. I stood like a pillar of reinforced steel. I did not say a single word to him. I marched straight to his table, my boots leaving thick puddles of swamp water on the clean linoleum floor. I raised my hand and slammed a piece of torn cardboard down onto the metal surface. On the back of the cardboard, I had drawn my own topographical map using a chunk of burnt charcoal. I marked the exact extraction coordinates with 100% accuracy. The command post fell dead silent. Decker dropped his red pen. He stared at the charcoal lines, his jaw hanging slightly open in pure shock. In the far corner of the room, Brigadier General Vance sat in a canvas folding chair. The legendary African-American commander slowly reached up and pulled off his dark sunglasses. His sharp eyes scanned my bleeding arms, the dripping mud, and finally the precise map on the table. He did not clap. He did not offer any empty, patronizing praise. He simply reached out, picked up his steaming black coffee, and pushed it across the table. The heavy ceramic mug slid across the smooth metal surface and stopped right in front of my hand. This brutal arena had officially bowed its head. I curled my bleeding fingers around the warm ceramic. The bitter heat of the coffee shot through my veins, but it was not enough to prepare me for the blazing heat of the Iraqi desert that was waiting for me next. The bitter heat of General Vance's black coffee faded, instantly swallowed by the suffocating 120-degree oven of Al Anbar Province, Iraq. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center tasted like fine sand and burnt diesel. The radio speakers mounted on the wall were screaming. A Marine recon unit was pinned down in a gutted, abandoned marketplace. Urban warfare is a meat grinder, and they were caught right in the teeth of it. You could hear the supersonic crack of AK-47 rounds bleeding through the static, followed immediately by the desperate hoarse shouts of a radio man. Taking heavy casualties pinned down. We need QRF right damn now. The quick reaction force was hesitating. The crossfire in that sector was too thick a guaranteed suicide run. Protocol dictated my place. As a staff captain, my job was to sit safely behind a metal desk, push paper, and stare at the flashing red coordinates on the monitor as they turned from active to KIA. But I wasn't built to sit behind a desk while my people bled out on the street. I shoved my heavy steel chair back. It hit the wall with a loud bang. I grabbed my M4 rifle from the rack. I slapped a loaded magazine into the mag well, the metal clicked sharp and decisive. I threw my heavy Kevlar vest over my shoulders, locked the plates tight against my chest, and walked straight out into the blinding desert sun. I bypassed the stalling officers, climbed directly onto the hood of the lead-up armored Humvee, and slammed the steel butt of my rifle hard against the armored roof. "Put this truck in gear," I ordered the driver through the cracked glass. "We are moving out." We barreled into the city. It was a maze of crumbled concrete and thick black smoke that choked out the sun. The air smelled of rust and burning tires. The ambush happened in a heartbeat. A high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek tore through the narrow street. An RPG. It slammed directly into the side of the vehicle ahead of us. The explosion was deafening. A massive ball of orange fire and twisted steel erupted into the sky. The shockwave rattled my teeth. The convoy slammed on the brakes. Marines scrambled out of the troop carriers, diving behind concrete barriers as heavy machine gun fire rained down from the rooftops. Panic is a virus on the battlefield, and it was spreading fast. I ripped the radio handset off the dash. My voice did not shake. It cut through the screaming and the gunfire, cold and heavy as a solid iron anvil. "All units, this is Captain Owen. You will hold the line, establish a 360 perimeter right damn now. Suppressing fire 2 o'clock. Rocco, give me a casualty report." That cold, ruthless discipline snapped them out of it. The panic died. Muscle memory and training took over. They shouldered their rifles and returned fire, laying down a punishing wall of lead. Through the thick, choking dust, I saw him. Master Sergeant Diaz. The old war dog was down. His trousers were painted dark red, his legs pinned awkwardly near the rear tires of a supply truck that was currently burning out of control. Rounds were chewing up the asphalt inches from his head, kicking up sharp chips of rock. Nobody could reach him without getting cut in half by the crossfire. I didn't think about my father. I didn't think about my sister or the country club dinners. I just moved. I broke cover and sprinted straight into the kill zone. The air ripped open around me. Something hot and incredibly heavy slammed into my left shoulder. It felt like being hit by a swinging baseball bat covered in jagged spikes. Shrapnel. Hot blood instantly soaked the left side of my vest, running down my arm. I ground my teeth together, swallowing a scream. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I slid into the dirt next to Diaz. I grabbed the heavy nylon drag handle on the back of his Kevlar vest. I planted my combat boots flat against the rough asphalt. Using every ounce of explosive muscle in my legs and back, I hauled his dead weight backward. We dragged across the abrasive street, leaving a thick, dark trail behind us. I threw us both behind a crumbled brick wall just a fraction of a second before the burning truck blew sky high. Burning metal and chunks of rubber rained down on our helmets. I looked at Diaz. He looked at me. We were bleeding, filthy, and alive. The world eventually went black. When I opened my eyes, the smell of cordite and blood was gone. It was replaced by the sharp, stinging odor of rubbing alcohol and bleached sheets. A ventilator beeped a steady, slow rhythm next to my ear. I was lying in a sterile bed at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, back on American soil. My left shoulder was heavily bandaged, a dull, relentless ache throbbing deep inside the bone. I wasn't alone. Standing at the exact foot of my bed was Corporal Rocco. His utility uniform was wrinkled and the shadows under his eyes looked like dark bruises, but his posture was rigid. He stepped forward. He didn't offer a fake sugary smile. He didn't judge my messy hair, my pale face, or my lack of makeup. He simply reached into a plastic bag, pulled out an ice-cold can of Coca-Cola, and placed it on my bedside table. Then he took a deliberate step backward. His boots slammed together. The sharp crack of his heels echoed like a gunshot in the quiet hospital room. A perfect, razor-sharp salute. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was thick with an absolute, unbreakable loyalty. Valkyrie. A Valkyrie. The chooser of the slain. The protector of warriors on the battlefield. Looking at Rocco, I realized the bitter truth. My biological family wanted to bury my identity to protect their hedge fund reputation. But these men, these strangers with completely different DNA, were willing to take a bullet for me, simply because I did my job and protected their backs. I had finally found my real family. They were not forged at a mahogany dining table. They were forged in mudblood and gunfire. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the pillow, ready to embrace the first moment of real peace I had felt in years. But the silence didn't last. From the far corner of the sterile room, a sharp electronic click echoed. The wall-mounted television flashed to life, and the toxic nightmare I thought I left behind was pulled straight into my sanctuary. The sharp electronic click of the wall-mounted television shattered the heavy, respectful silence Corporal Rocco had just left behind in my hospital room. I rolled my head against the stiff, bleach-scented pillow. The morning news blared across the flat screen. And there she was. Serafina. She was sitting on a plush leather couch in a bright national television studio. She wore a dark tailored designer dress, respectful, yet undeniably expensive. Her makeup was flawless, strategically applied to make her look exhausted, like a woman who had been awake for days, praying for her little sister. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a tissue, squeezing out a few rehearsed crocodile tears as the host asked her about the heartbreak of military families. Then the studio monitor flashed a graphic behind her head. My stomach dropped like a lead weight. It was a photograph of me, the medevac picture taken on the dusty tarmac right after we were pulled out of Al-Anbar. But it was completely butchered. They cropped it. They digitally blurred out the silver captain's bars pinned to my collar. They completely cut out Master Sergeant Diaz and the two other Marines who were physically carrying my bleeding body onto the chopper. All that was left in the frame was my face, pale, smeared with black mud and dried blood, looking terrified, small, and incredibly weak. She erased my rank. She erased my brothers. She erased the firefight. Serafina hijacked my blood and turned it into a cheap, pitiful sob story, just to squeeze donations out of a gullible daytime TV audience. It was the ultimate form of stolen valor. My cell phone vibrated violently against the metal tray table next to my bed. The screen lit up. "Dad!" I swiped the cracked glass and held the phone to my ear. He didn't ask if I was awake. He didn't ask if the shrapnel had shattered my collarbone or if the surgeons managed to pull all the jagged steel out of my back. His voice was thick with the aggressive, fast-paced adrenaline of a Wall Street shark who just smelled fresh blood in the water. "Lauren, you did great," he said. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the low hum of a corporate boardroom in the background. "Keep a low profile, stay weak, stay fragile." Serafina's veteran charity fund is raking in millions in civilian donations this morning. My corporate partners absolutely eat up this patriotic, grieving family angle. Do not talk to the press. Do not ruin this for us. Keep your mouth shut and let your sister handle the PRETR. A massive wave of nausea crawled up my throat, sour and thick. I stared at the clear plastic IV tube taped to the back of my hand. The cold saline dripped steadily into my vein. It hit me right then. A cold, brutal, undeniable truth. They did not see my sacrifice. They did not see the heavy black body bags lined up on the hot tarmac at Dover Air Force Base. To them, the blood of a United States Marine was nothing but cheap cosmetic powder to smear over their rotting corporate balance sheets. I was not a daughter. I was a tax write-off, a bloody prop to be exploited for social leverage. I reached over with my right hand. I grabbed the hard plastic IV hub taped to my skin. I did not call the nurse. I did not ask for permission. I ripped it straight out. The heavy medical tape tore my skin. The thick steel needle slid out of my vein with a sharp pinch. Dark, warm blood immediately pooled on the back of my hand, dripping heavily onto the crisp white hospital sheets. I did not grab a bandage. I did not care. It was time to apply strict combat discipline to my own bloodline. You cut off the enemy's supply chain. You burned the bridge. I hit the keypad and dialed Serafina's private cell number. She answered on the very first ring. Lauren, we are trending on. I didn't let her finish. My voice was a block of solid ice. It carried the exact same heavy executioner's tone I used to lock down panicking troops in the smoking alleys of Fallujah. Listen to me very carefully, Serafina, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. The blood of my Marines is not a prop for your bank account. Do not ever put my face on a screen again. Do not ever speak my name to the press. You are done. I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the red end button before she could even draw a breath to argue. I didn't stop there. My thumb hovered over her contact name. I hit block. I scrolled down to my father's number. Block. I scrolled through my contact list, hunting down every aunt, every uncle, every single corporate parasite who sat at that Thanksgiving table and laughed while I was erased. Block, block, block. I built a permanent, impenetrable razor wire fence around my life with a few aggressive taps on a glass screen. I wiped them off the map. I excommunicated my own family, stripping them of any right to exist in my reality. If you have ever had your own trauma, your pain, or your hardest achievements hijacked by toxic family members who only wanted to make themselves look good, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment, "Cut the tie," down below. I know exactly how much it hurts to realize your family is just using you for their own image. Sometimes building an absolute concrete wall is the only way we survive. The phone gave a soft final electronic beep as the last block registered in the system. I tossed the device onto the foot of the mattress. The screen went black. The television was already muted. The hospital room dropped into a deep, heavy, absolute silence. It was just me, the slow dripping of blood on my knuckles, and a brand new, terrifyingly empty space where my past used to be. The silence in that hospital room didn't last. I didn't let it. I filled the empty space my family left behind with a brand new war. Years passed. I climbed the ranks, trading my combat boots for the polished leather shoes of the Pentagon, eventually pinning 4 silver stars to my collar. But the real battlefield wasn't in the Middle East anymore. It was in the driveways and dark garages of the men and women who came home with us. I stood in the glaring, sterile light of the county morgue, staring down at a crumpled, blood-stained piece of loose-leaf paper in an evidence bag. It belonged to Corporal Evans. He was one of the finest snipers I ever had the privilege of commanding. 2 days ago, the Veterans Affairs Hospital denied his request for emergency psychiatric treatment. They told him to fill out a form and wait 6 months. Last night, he locked the doors to his garage, started his engine, and let the carbon monoxide do what the insurgents couldn't. His handwriting was a jagged, desperate scrawl. The very last line read, "General Owen is the only one who ever saw me." That piece of paper felt heavier than a titanium armor plate. The grief threatened to crush my lungs, but I forced it down into a cold, hard block of iron at the bottom of my stomach. I refused to let my people die waiting in line. I drafted Project Aegis, a massive, aggressive psychological defense network designed to bypass the broken VA and get combat vets immediate help. No red tape, no waiting lists. But a good plan without funding is just a piece of trash. I took the proposal straight to the E-ring of the Pentagon. I stood at attention in front of a heavy mahogany desk, pitching the budget to a 3-star general who hadn't seen a speck of dirt since the Gulf War. He sat slouched in his oversized leather chair, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. He barely skimmed the executive summary. He tossed my heavy manila folder straight into the metal trash can next to his desk. "Mental cases are a bad return on investment, Owen." He sneered, leaning back and resting his hands on his gut. "We need trigger pullers. We need next-gen weapons systems. We do not need a billion-dollar therapy room for grunts who can't handle a little bad weather in their heads." The air in the office went ice cold. He sounded exactly like my father. It was the exact same toxic corporate disregard for human life. To them, we were just broken tools, liabilities on a spreadsheet. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my fists on his mahogany desk or beg for common decency. I locked my knees. I kept my chin perfectly parallel to the floor. I took 2 steps forward, bent down, and pulled my files out of the trash. I smoothed the wrinkled corners with the flat of my thumb. "Understood, sir." I said, my voice dead flat. I turned on my heel and walked out. If they wanted to treat my Marines like a bad investment, I needed to speak their language. I didn't need a fiery speech. I needed data. I needed heavy artillery built out of undeniable cold, hard numbers. That was when Julian Croft walked into the trenches with me. Julian didn't wear a uniform. He was a civilian strategic data analyst for the Department of Defense. He wore thick, horn-rimmed glasses rolled up the sleeves of his cheap cotton shirts and practically lived on burnt 3 a.m. black coffee. Every man in that building either walked on eggshells around my 4 stars or resented me for having them. Julian didn't care about the metal on my collar. He didn't flinch at the jagged scar creeping up my neck. He looked me dead in the eye and respected the brain inside my skull. We spent 6 months working in a windowless basement office. The fluorescent lights hummed a relentless migraine-inducing rhythm. While I pulled the raw combat reports, Julian sat behind 3 glowing monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He took the tears, the night terrors, and the blood of my Marines and coded them into razor-sharp algorithms. He built predictive models that proved down to the exact dollar that letting a trained veteran die from PTSD cost the government 10 times more than funding Project Aegis. He weaponized the truth. We took that massive bulletproof binder of data and dropped it right onto the desk of the Congressional Armed Services Committee. We cornered them with their own logic. They choked on the numbers and finally authorized the budget. Julian became my anchor. He was the quiet, steady hum of logic in a life that was entirely defined by chaos. He never asked me to soften up. He never told me to leave my armor at the door. He just stood right beside me holding the line. It happened on a Tuesday. It was 2 a.m. We were sitting in my cramped kitchen. The linoleum floor was cold. The table was buried under a mountain of budget approvals and empty coffee mugs. I was rubbing my burning eyes, exhausted to my bones. Julian reached into his pocket. He didn't get down on one knee. There were no overpriced roses, no string quartets, no fake upper-class pageantry. He just pulled out a plain, unpolished silver band and slid it across the kitchen table. It stopped right on top of a classified DOD memo. I looked at the ring, then up at him. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and held my gaze. "Are we going to watch each other's backs for the rest of our lives, General?" he asked. His voice was dead serious, completely stripped of any romantic nonsense. It was a tactical commitment. I looked at this man, a civilian who understood loyalty better than anyone I shared blood with. I set my pen down. I picked up the silver ring, slipped it onto my finger, and nodded. I finally had a permanent safe harbor. But in my world, peace never lasts. The quiet flash of that silver ring was a massive blind spot. Because the exact second the news of my engagement leaked out of the Pentagon, it lit a match right over the gasoline-soaked ego of the sister I had cut out of my life. The news of my engagement leaked out of the Pentagon like blood in shark-infested water. It took less than 48 hours for the rumors to reach Serafina. And the exact second she realized I was building a life entirely out of her control, she lost her mind. She launched her final desperate strike. She didn't confront me in person. She was too much of a coward for that. She did it on Twitter. My cell phone started vibrating against my desk, a relentless high-pitched ping, ping, ping of notifications going off like a fire alarm. I unlocked the screen. The post was a masterpiece of upper-class manipulation. It was a staged high-definition photograph. A heavy mud-caked combat boot stomping brutally down on the corner of a pristine, white-tiered wedding cake. Smashed vanilla frosting mixed with dirty rubber tire treads. The caption underneath dripped with pure concentrated arsenic. "When you can't tell the difference between a battlefield and an altar. Congratulations to my power-hungry, violent little sister. Pray for the groom. #dictator bride." The internet is a meat grinder, and my own flesh and blood just threw me straight into the blades. The picture went viral by noon. Trashy gossip blogs and basement-dwelling internet trolls swarmed the feed like flies on roadkill. They tore into me. They painted me as some hulking, unhinged brute in a uniform. a violent freak stripping away all the romance and femininity of a wedding day. They called me a broken war machine trying to play dress-up. My personal phone lit up next. Texts from aunts, uncles, and cousins flooded the screen. Are you seriously going to wear combat boots down the aisle? Try not to shoot the priest, Lauren. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to drag myself down into the mud to scream and fight them in the comment sections so they could point their fingers and call me unstable. They wanted to drown me in the same psychological swamp they kept me in when I was 16. I sat alone in my Pentagon office. The overhead fluorescent lights were dead. The only illumination was the harsh, cold glare of the computer monitor washing over my face. I picked up my ceramic mug. The black tea was room temperature and bitter. I took a slow sip. I didn't type a single letter. I didn't release a public relations statement. I used my absolute silence as a heavy iron shield. Serafina was a master manipulator in country club dining rooms. She knew how to play corporate billionaires and daytime television hosts. But she made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. She forgot who I belonged to. She forgot who I commanded. She thought she was attacking a lonely, isolated scapegoat. She didn't realize she'd just thrown a rock into a hornet's nest of trained killers. It started around midnight. A slow trickle at first, then a massive, unstoppable tidal wave. Tens of thousands of active-duty Marines, retired combat veterans, and Gold Star families woke up, checked their phones, and saw the absolute disrespect directed at a four-star general. They did not wait for my orders. They took the fight directly to her front door. They hijacked her toxic hashtag. Within 12 hours, hashtag #DictatorBride was completely wiped off the trending page. It was crushed, buried under the weight of a brand new battle cry, hashtag Valkyrie honor. The truth didn't need a slick PR agency to defend it. The truth roared out of the mouths of the wolves protecting their pack. The feed refreshed. The screen exploded with a completely different kind of picture. Thousands of them. Female military officers standing proudly at their altars, wearing the midnight blue of their dress uniforms. Silver medals gleaming over white silk. Combat veterans posting pictures of their own shrapnel scars, fiercely defending the honor of the uniform Serafina tried to drag through the dirt. One post stopped me cold. It was from a Gold Star mother. She posted a picture of her son's folded American flag. The caption read, "General Owen dragged my boy out of the fire so I could bury him at home. What have you ever carried besides a designer handbag?" Then the Marines turned their sights directly on my sister. Thousands of comments flooded Serafina's perfectly manicured social media accounts. They stripped away her fake charity founder mask. They hit her with the cold, brutal discipline of the enlisted ranks. They exposed her for exactly what she was: a bitter, hollow fraud exploiting veteran blood for social status. Her inbox collapsed under the weight of the assault. Her corporate public relations team panicked and locked her accounts down, turning them private. She tried to bury me in the mud, but she dug her own social grave in front of the entire country. The dark blue ocean of the United States Marine Corps swallowed her elite reputation whole. I placed my ceramic mug down on the desk. The sharp clink echoed in the dark office. I reached forward and snapped the laptop shut. The digital war was over. I had won without firing a single shot. But a computer screen is just glass and wire. I knew the real fight wasn't finished. The memory of that dark Pentagon office faded into the harsh, freezing reality of the present. I blinked, my lungs filled with the sharp scent of brass polish and heavy wool. I was no longer sitting at my desk. I was standing in the freezing dressing room of the Quantico Base Chapel. The hollow ticking of the vintage pocket watch returned to my ears. The physical confrontation was waiting for me right on the other side of this heavy oak door. I smoothed the 4 silver stars pinned to my shoulders. I reached out. My bare fingers wrapped around the freezing brass handle. My knuckles tightened, the joints popping in the quiet room. I took a deep breath, preparing to push the door open and face the firing squad of my own family. But before I could even turn the knob, the solid concrete ground beneath my combat boots began to violently shake. The shattered screen of my phone lay dead on the heavy rosewood vanity. Tiny jagged shards of broken glass still dug into the soft palm of my hand. A single drop of dark blood welled up and dried tight against my skin. I did not wipe it away. I had hung up the phone. I had cut the feed. I had dropped a permanent concrete wall between myself and the toxic poison spewing from my father and Serafina. But cutting the wire did not stop the bleeding. The absolute suffocating isolation of the Quantico-based chapel dressing room closed around my throat like a vice. It was my wedding day. There were no aunts knocking on the door with glasses of expensive champagne. There were no uncles laughing in the hallway adjusting their silk ties. There were no cousins crowding the room helping me pin my hair. There was nothing. Just an empty, freezing, oak-paneled room and the hollow, relentless ticking of a vintage pocket watch resting on the counter. They had made their choice. They stayed out in the main hall, joining my father's silent, calculated boycott. They were waiting out there like vultures. They fully expected me to break. They thought the heavy, crushing weight of their collective silence would force me to strip off this military uniform, put on a flimsy white silk dress, and walk out into the nave as a compliant, brainless little puppet for their corporate photo op. I turned away from the vanity. I walked slowly toward the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the room. My heavy combat boots thumped against the cold marble floor, the sound echoing off the bare walls. I stopped. I stared at the reflection of the woman trapped in the glass. My rough, calloused fingers reached up on their own. I traced the edge of the stiff, midnight blue wool collar. I ran my thumb over the small enameled block of colors pinned carefully over my left breast pocket. The combat action ribbon. The hard metal edges bit deeply into my skin. It was not just a piece of fabric. The exact second my fingers brushed against it, the freezing, air-conditioned air of the chapel vanished. I felt the blistering 120-degree heat of Al-Anbar burning the inside of my lungs. I smelled the suffocating heavy stench of burning diesel fuel, melting rubber, and charred Humvee armor. I heard the screaming. I tasted the bitter copper of blood in the back of my throat. This dark blue uniform was not a costume. It was a physical diary. Every single heavy thread was woven from the blood, the sweat, and the final violent breaths of the Marines who had died on the asphalt, so I could stand in this room today. If I took this uniform off just to protect the fragile ego of a shallow Wall Street businessman and a narcissistic sister, I would be betraying the only real blood I had left. The thought made my stomach turn. A cold, solid block of iron settled deep inside my chest. The doubt died. The hesitation evaporated. The resolve froze into solid steel. Out in the main nave, the heavy metal pipes of the chapel organ began to hum. The organist played a few broken, disjointed chords, warming up for a ceremony that was rapidly falling apart. Through the narrow crack under the heavy oak door, the noise of the crowd leaked into my room. I could hear the sharp, arrogant clack-clack of designer heels pacing the stone floors. I heard the low, smug murmurs of wealthy corporate executives. I heard the fake, high-pitched laughter of people who thought they had just won a war without getting their hands dirty. They were gloating out there. They truly believed that upper-class social pressure and the threat of total public humiliation would snap the spine of the defective daughter. They wanted me to crawl out there broken and embarrassed and beg for a seat at their table. My chest rose and fell. I closed my eyes. I started counting in my head. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Tactical box breathing. It slowed my racing heart rate. It pushed the toxic noise of the socialites entirely out of my skull. I did not need a father to walk me down that aisle. I did not need a front row filled with hypocritical, backstabbing relatives. I was going to walk out there completely alone. I was going to march straight into the deadly crossfire of their mocking eyes and prove that a United States Marine does not ever retreat, even when the enemy shares her own DNA. I opened my eyes. The cold focus of a battlefield commander locked into place. I stared at the 4 silver stars pinned to the shoulders of my uniform. I brushed a single speck of dust off the dark wool. I turned my back to the mirror and walked straight toward the heavy oak door. I reached out. I wrapped my bare hand around the freezing brass doorknob. The cold metal grounded me. My knuckles tightened, the joints popping loudly in the quiet room. I locked my jaw, fully prepared to twist the handle, push the heavy wood open, and step out into the firing squad. I squeezed the brass, but before I could apply a single ounce of pressure to turn the knob, the floor shifted. A massive, deep tremor shot through the solid concrete foundation of the chapel. It traveled straight up through the thick rubber soles of my boots, rattling the bones in my legs. It was a low, thunderous vibration. It sounded exactly like an earthquake. But it was not an earthquake, and it was not the footsteps of one single person. It was the synchronized, heavy, perfectly disciplined marching steps of hundreds of combat boots hitting the stone floor at the exact same time. The noise was deafening. The heavy 3-inch thick oak door in front of me began to shake violently in its frame. The brass hinges rattled and groaned under the pressure of a massive, overwhelming physical force coming to a halt right on the other side. They did not knock. They did not turn the handle. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the massive oak door was kicked violently off its hinges. The heavy oak door did not just open. It exploded inward. The 3-inch thick wood slammed violently against the chapel wall. The brass hinges snapped with a loud metallic shriek. A thick cloud of white drywall dust rained down onto the marble floor. I did not flinch. I let go of the brass handle and took one step forward out of the dressing room. Standing in the center of the doorway was Master Sergeant Diaz. His hair was completely gray now, cut close to the scalp. He wore his full-dress blue uniform, the gold chevrons on his sleeves razor sharp. He did not have an invitation to this wedding. He didn't need one. His eyes were bloodshot, locked onto mine with an intensity that burned through the dust. But Diaz was not alone. I looked past his shoulders. The massive vaulted nave of the Quantico Chapel was completely full. It was an absolute sea of midnight blue and blood red. 500 United States Marines. They poured in from bases across the eastern seaboard. They stood shoulder to shoulder, packing the aisles, blocking the heavy wooden pews, and entirely choking out the natural light coming through the stained glass windows. 500 men and women standing as rigid as steel statues, breathing as one massive living machine. The air was thick with the crisp smell of heavy wool brass polish and raw unchecked power. The arrogant, high-pitched laughter of the corporate elites died instantly. The sudden silence in the chapel was terrifying. The organist froze his hands, hovering stiffly over the keys. The Wall Street executives, the hedge fund managers, the socialites with their expensive champagne, they were paralyzed. They stopped whispering. They stopped breathing. The pure primal fear of a soft civilian crowd suddenly trapped in a room with 500 trained killers sucked the oxygen right out of the building. Diaz took one deliberate step forward. His heavy combat boots hit the marble with a sickening thud. He did not glance at my father. He did not look at Serafina. He kept his eyes locked, dead forward, staring directly into my face. Then it happened. 500 pairs of combat boots slammed their heels together at the exact same fraction of a second. The sound was a deafening, bone-rattling crack. It echoed off the arched ceiling like a synchronized bomb blast. It shook the wooden pews. It rattled the stained glass in its lead frames. Diaz opened his mouth. His voice did not sound like a wedding guest. It sounded like the battlefield. It was a vicious, guttural roar that tore through the absolute silence of the church. Attention. Present arms. 500 right hands snapped up in perfect, terrifying unison. 500 razor-sharp salutes cutting through the air. This was not a polite social greeting. This was an impenetrable wall of honor, a wall built entirely out of blood, urban warfare, and absolute loyalty. They did not care about the money sitting in the front rows. They did not care about the designer dresses or the corporate connections. They were here for their general. I stepped fully out of the dressing room. I let my eyes sweep over the front pews. My father and Serafina were sitting in the VIP section. They were completely surrounded. They were shrinking into the heavy wooden benches, physically cowering away from the wall of dark blue uniforms pressing in on them. My father's face was the color of dirty ash. He looked small. He looked irrelevant. And Serafina, the mastermind, the architect of my misery. Her face was paper white, completely drained of blood. The skin around her eyes was tight and wrinkled with pure, unfiltered panic. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead, causing her flawless, expensive makeup to run down her cheeks in muddy, ugly streaks. Her posture was completely broken. She sat slouched, her shoulders hunched forward, her hands trembling in her lap. That ridiculous, overpriced silk dress she wore suddenly looked like a cheap, dirty rag compared to the heavy, honorable weight of the military uniforms surrounding her. She spent her entire life using money and manipulation to drag me down into the mud. She worked so hard to isolate me. But today she bought a front row VIP ticket just to watch her own absolute destruction. Her arrogant upper-class mask was completely crushed under the heels of 500 combat boots. I looked at her terrified, shaking face. I felt the urge to smile, but I didn't. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not stop to gloat. I did not throw her toxic words back in her face. The ultimate form of contempt is not shouting at your enemy. It is completely erasing their existence from your reality. I locked my jaw. I squared my shoulders, feeling the heavy weight of the 4 silver stars pinned to my collar. I raised my right hand, executing a slow, perfect, razor-sharp salute back to Diaz and my Marines. "Order arms," I commanded, my voice calm, steady, and carrying effortlessly across the silent room. 500 hands snapped down. I began to walk. I marched slowly down the center aisle, moving through the gauntlet of steel and dark blue wool. I did not look at the pews. I walked right past my father. I walked right past Serafina. I drifted past them like they were nothing but irrelevant, invisible ghosts lingering in an empty hallway. They no longer existed in my world. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. At the very end of the long aisle, standing by the altar, was Julian. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore a simple dark suit. His hands were folded in front of him, and he was smiling. It was a quiet, fiercely proud smile. The psychological war was over. I executed the perfect campaign of retaliation. I did not waste a single bullet. I did not spill a single drop of sweat. I simply let the truth roar loud enough to shatter the foundation of their lies. I reached the end of the aisle. I stopped in front of Julian. He reached out and took my calloused, scarred hand in his. I turned my back completely to the crowd of ghosts sitting in the pews behind me, ready to finally close the door on the past. My wedding reception did not happen in a 5-star hotel ballroom. There were no crystal chandeliers, no overpriced caviar, and absolutely no string quartets. We rented an active military aircraft hangar just off the airstrip. The massive corrugated steel doors were rolled wide open to the night air. The place smelled like raw jet fuel, roasted pork, and cheap domestic beer. The concrete floor echoed with loud, unfiltered laughter, the heavy clinking of thick glass mugs, and the kind of dark, brutal combat stories you only share with people who have bled in the exact same dirt as you. It was loud, it was rough, it was perfect. The next morning, the Virginia sun broke through the slanted blinds of our kitchen window. I stood at the counter, leaning my weight against the cool granite, drinking black coffee out of a chipped ceramic mug. Julian sat at the wooden table, quietly reading a classified briefing file, his glasses pushed down the bridge of his nose. My phone buzzed against the stone counter. A single email notification popped up on the cracked glass of the lock screen. The sender was Serafina. For the first time in 30 years, the subject line wasn't a passive-aggressive jab. It wasn't a trap designed to make me feel small. I set my coffee mug down. I tapped the screen and opened the text. It was short. It reeked of absolute terrifying defeat. "Dad keeps saying you are a disgrace. He's drinking himself blind in the den right now. But when I saw those 500 Marines snap to attention for you, when I saw the way they looked at you, I realized this entire family is the actual joke. We spent our whole lives pretending to be royalty. We just bought expensive clothes. You actually built an army. We don't salute blood, Lauren. We salute the truth." I stared at the black text on the glaring white screen. I waited for the rush of adrenaline. I waited for the heavy, satisfying hit of vindication that you see in the movies. I expected to feel the deep, burning urge to screenshot it, to print it out, to frame it, and shove it back in their faces at the next holiday dinner. But nothing came. There was no gloating. There was no anger. There was just a massive, quiet, empty space inside my chest. My lungs expanded, and for the first time since I was a little girl, sitting at that oak dining table, the air felt incredibly light. My greatest enemy, the architect of a psychological war that nearly broke my spine, was just a small, pathetic woman sitting in a quiet, overpriced house, realizing she was entirely irrelevant. The oxygen supply to her cycle of abuse was permanently cut. I didn't type out a brutal, victorious reply. I didn't save the email for leverage. My calloused thumb moved over the screen. I tapped the small trash can icon. Delete. I dropped the phone face down onto the glass coffee table. The sharp clack of the metal casing hitting the thick glass echoed in the quiet kitchen. That was it. The absolute greatest revenge you can ever achieve is not forcing your enemy to beg for forgiveness. It is reaching a point where their apology is entirely worthless to your survival. Time does not stop for family drama. It marches forward, heavy and relentless. 5 years later, I stood on the polished wood of the highest commendation stage inside the Pentagon. The heavy glare of the press cameras flashed across the large room, bouncing off the 4 silver stars pinned to my collar. Project Aegis was no longer a stack of discarded papers in a general's metal trash can. It was a massive, federally funded machine. We bypassed the broken VA lines. We pulled thousands of combat veterans out of dark garages, cheap motel rooms, and the edges of highway bridges. We put them back on their feet. We handed them their lives back. I looked down from the heavy wooden podium. The front row was not filled with corporate executives looking for a tax write-off. A young female Marine stepped out of the front formation and approached the stage. She wore a flawless dress blue uniform. The brass buttons caught the overhead lights polished to a blinding shine. She stopped exactly 3 paces from the podium. She snapped her heels together. The sound was a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the Pentagon walls. Captain Eva Diaz, Master Sergeant Diaz's daughter. She raised her white-gloved hand in a razor-sharp salute. She didn't look at my scars. She looked dead into my eyes with the exact same fierce, unbreakable loyalty her father had in the Iraqi dirt. I raised my hand and returned the salute. This was the legacy of the Valkyrie. It wasn't a bloated bank account. It wasn't a fake smile plastered on the cover of a high society magazine. It was living, breathing human beings. It was the fire of discipline passed down to the next generation of fighters. Roosevelt was right the whole damn time. You do not get to pick the bloodline you are born into. You might get handed a family that views your brain as a threat and your scars as a joke. You might get stripped, mocked, and pushed completely out into the cold by the exact people who share your DNA. Let them. You have the absolute right to walk away from the cowards sitting in the cheap seats throwing rocks down at the arena. You take the hits, you keep your spine straight, and you build your own damn army out of grit, competence, and pure loyalty. You let the mud and the blood do the talking. And when you finally stand up, the truth will roar loud enough to crush every single lie they ever told about you. I lowered my hand, turned my back to the flashing cameras, and walked off the stage. I had work to do. The greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building an empire of glory they don't have the clearance to enter. If you agree, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment Valkyrie down below. I want to see who is still standing. Stay strong in your own arena.